as we go along. Just put something in the chat and I'll bring that up if people aren't hearing and things like that. And then if you have sort of general questions, put them in the chat, and either you can unmute yourself at the end and say it, or I can share that with Karl. We'll monitor it so he doesn't have to monitor the chat on top of everything else. So that's great. Okay, so we're so delighted to have Dr. Karl Pillemer with us as the Distinguished Wilson Abernethy Lecturer. This is actually a lecture series that started 40 years ago. Our first one was in 1982. We don't necessarily do it every year. So Dr. Pillemer is actually doing our 24th Distinguished Wilson Abernethy Lecture. It's named after Wilson Abernethy, who was the president of Anthos Industries, and he was founder and first president of the Senior Alumni Association at the University of Toronto. So with no further ado, let me introduce Karl. So Karl,
I have managed somehow to disrupt the thing I was sharing.
Yes.
So unfortunately, it's that we're almost there.
Okay, well, I can go on and do more. Let me do a longer intro and you can play a wet round while I do the intro. How's that?
I think yeah, sure, do that. I just am going to dizzy everybody by
okay.
doing this. I think we're almost there.
Okay, so Karl Pillemer is an American sociologist and gerontologist who is internationally renowned. He's well known to us at the Institute for Life Course and Aging, as early in his career, while he was at the University of New Hampshire, he worked with the Canadian nursing professor Elizabeth Podnieks, who's here today with us. We're so delighted, to conduct the first national survey on elder abuse in Canada, which was published in 1989. And that became the benchmark for prevalent rates in Canada. He's done a survey in Boston in '88 on elder abuse. He's done all kinds of research to reduce mistreatment and to improve staff training to help reduce conflict and abuse in long-term care and nursing homes. And he's authored 5 books in that area. But after moving to Cornell in 1990, Karl also focused on his research on intergenerational relations in later life. And that was my first area. I finished my PhD in 1995, and I quoted Karl a lot, even then. In later, with strong theoretical and empirical interests in life course transitions and the effects that they have on family relationships. Karl founded the Cornell Legacy Project, which has collected the life wisdom of over 2,000 older adults since 2004. Using this research, Karl has worked internationally to promote the role of older people as sources of practical advice and to encourage both individuals and organizations to incorporate elder wisdom into our daily lives. He's authored a number of books based on the Legacy Project and received all kinds of media attention internationally and nationally. His books are 30 Lessons for Living, Tried and True Advice from the Wisest Americans, and 30 Lessons for Loving, Advice from the Wisest Americans on Love, Relationships, and Marriage. And most recently, Fault Lines, Fractured Families and How to Mend Them. Karl is the Hazel E. Reed Professor of Human Development at Cornell University, and he's director of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research and professor of gerontology and medicine at the Weill Cornell Medicine in Cornell. We look forward to his distinguished lecture here today, What Elder Wisdom Can Teach Us, Insights from Cornell's Legacy Project. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, great. Thanks for that loving, thanks for that, the wonderful introduction. And everybody can, I can't see anyone else, but everyone can hear me and see the slides. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, all good.
Excellent. Oh, that's always such a relief. No, I feel tremendously close as made to you and the folks in your center and also in Canada. The survey that Elizabeth and I did was a great sort of introduction to gerontology in Canada and the work you and your colleagues have done through also now my current work with David Burns that has also been tremendous. So the only sad thing is I'm here on sabbatical and of course you all are not in person. So we're doing things like this, but it's certainly better than nothing. So It really is a pleasure to be here. And as you were saying the introduction, we were talking a bit, beforehand. For anybody who knows my work on elder abuse, that this project sometimes has seemed a little bit disorienting, because it's kind of the flip side of the negative aspects that we find with elder mistreatment. But I'll tell you in a minute how I got there, because I think the two do and can fit together. So I want to begin with a little bit of a social science piece here, although you're right, this lecture is not, you aren't going to see a regression equation or even a crosstab. This really is more general and not a true scientific presentation, but there's a lot of science behind it. And one of the aspects of this project over the years, and especially with our development of a new intervention program, has been what I believe is a surprising gap in wisdom research. As I'm sure most of you know, wisdom research has been an extremely vigorous area of research enterprise over the last 20 and especially the last 10 years, with people now devoting their careers to understanding things like what determines wisdom, what is wisdom, and how do we define it. And in a whole range of fields, from business to law to social psychology and other areas, what are the consequences of people who are judged to be wise? So people who have these characteristics of being able to distance themselves from the emotion of a situation, take the big picture, are high on socio-emotional intelligence and so forth. What consequences does that have? Does it improve clinical judgment? Does it lead to occupational success and to physical and psychological well-being? And the answer to varying degrees is yes. But what's missing in all of this, and especially over the last year or so that I've been really looking at this literature more carefully, what's missing is what most of us tend to think about when we think of wisdom, and that's its transmission. The sort of archetypal wisdom situation is when a person, and typically an older person or a mentor, imparts life wisdom to someone else. And there's very little research on this. It sort of stops with understanding who's wise and why. And it sort of stops with the idea of how is wisdom transmitted? What are the effects of contact with individuals who we consider to be wise? Basically, little attention has been paid to situations in which people actually sit and listen to and accept and process the wisdom, and in particular, the sort of practical life advice of older people. So I think the one goal that really needs to be placed front and center in wisdom-related research is extending research on wisdom into real-world settings, because these are the sort of archetypal manifestations of wisdom, is advice giving and guidance. And I'll come back to how we have tried to incorporate these principles into an evidence-based program. One thing I want to say as a framing as well, and again, I'll come back to this so when I talk about the program, is we very rarely in this world get the opportunity to solve two problems at once. And here we have what Staudinger and colleagues have called complementary motivational concerns, that we have youth, young people, and emerging adults, even into their 30s, having needs for identity formation, matching with the generativity needs of older adults. So we have a situation where wisdom sharing, like the kind I'm going to talk to you about, actually fits the developmental needs of both young people and older people. Namely that, ever since Erik Erikson's original work, more and more research has accumulated showing that older people developmentally want to express generativity, namely investment in a future that they themselves may not live to see and creating a better world for future generations. While young people are actively engaged in forming an identity, developing a sense of purpose and meaning, they're motivated by the search for knowledge about themselves, about life in general. So, the concept of sharing wisdom is potentially a very powerful one, both for research and for intervention. Now, on one level, it seems a little funny that I have to say this because it's only been in about the last 100 years or so that people have gone to anyone other than the oldest person they knew for advice about life, advice about finding a partner, choosing work, really how to live a good life, and certainly how to age well. So it's something we have to remind ourselves of in contemporary society. So in response to this, since around 2005, we've been working, we still are working in this area to capture the practical advice of the oldest, and I call them wisest Americans, although there was at least a few Canadian interviewees. So there was a little bit of an international flair to this. The project was covered on the radio show Tapestry, and so we got a lot of interest from Canada after that. And in particular, because I started this project very serendipitously around 2005, many members of what some have called the greatest generation, I typically use the war and crisis generation, so people who lived through the Great Depression or saw work in it and either served in World War II or held their families together during it. Excuse me. I was able to capture the wisdom of those people who now, of course, are in their 90s, almost all of them, who are still left with us. So the legacy project for me, and I'll share a bit how I got there, was for me the most interesting academic adventure I've had. I got the chance, and my research team more broadly, but I personally got the chance to sit down with many very old people and ask them for their practical advice for living. So one thing that we were interested in capturing was not the kind of global Yoda-like wisdom or the character that Morgan Freeman plays in almost every movie these days, but rather something no one had ever done before, which is in a large and diverse sample, asking very old people what advice they would give to younger people for living a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life. It just really hadn't been done. So, and these were very deep and sometimes moving conversations of asking people in their 80s, 90s, and beyond what they learned over the course of life. And that was always our first question. As you look back over your long life, what are some of the lessons you've learned that you would like to pass on to future generations? So if a young person asks you, what are the most important things you've learned that would be useful to me living my life? What are these? Now, before I go on, let me give you an example of what that looks like. So, but what happens when you ask a very old person for their life advice? And this is Gert, who I interviewed a few days before her 101st birthday. And when asked for her lessons for living, here's what she said. Susan or Esme, if you're not hearing this break in, so let me know. Of us. Yeah, and for folks to know, I can't share the videos in the recording of this lecture, so that's why you're here, the recording going on and off, and thanks for showing that. Well, while I'm showing you some of the folks who we interviewed in the Legacy Project, I do want to say a word about how I got here, because I think it's relevant to the larger issue. And my sort of personal involvement in this was in, the mid early 2000s, 2005, 2006. I'd been a gerontologist for around 25 years. And I made a discovery, it hit me almost like a revelation, that everything I was studying and working on was about older people as problems and the problems of older people. So I was studying things like dementia, caregiving for people with dementia. I was studying issues around mental health and aging, this kind of a laundry list of, I was also, and still am, the co-director of a center for the study of chronic pain in older people. I was studying elder abuse, and I began almost to feel like I was rewriting the book of Job for old people. And that actually, as an aside, has to do a little bit with the nature of academic work. It's much easier for us to get funding for problems than it is for positive and helpful solutions. Susan, I see something in the chat, and I can't remember if we mentioned, if folks do want to enter questions in the chat, that may be easier. So that may have been said already and I missed it. If not, I'll say it again. Feel free to enter your questions there.
Yeah, these are just comments that people are liking what you're presenting so far. So you don't need to worry about them.
If you do have a question, please feel free to put it in there. So yeah, like nobody make a comment that you're not liking what I'm saying. That would be just hard. No, that's okay, be honest. So that began to strike me on a personal level as wrong, because I, like all of you, was meeting, both in research and in my personal life, vibrant, interesting, exciting, active older people. So, that didn't make sense. But also to touch on another social science finding, for folks who don't know this, that it's almost now a settled science that older people are happier than younger people. So, and this is a typical example from a survey that if you look at cross sections of the population, younger people tend to be pretty happy. That drops in middle age, and I can describe to you why that is, and kind of later on if folks are interested, in part. And it never recovers until the 60s. So the remarkable thing there, and what really got me to thinking, was here I'm studying all these problematized behaviors and experiences of older people, but why is it that in the face of a mounting burden of chronic illness, in the face of accumulating loss, older people are still happier than younger people? And this kind of finding, it cuts across almost any way you measure it. Like if you ask people how happy were the last 5 years, older people are more likely to say they were happier. And it's even got a name, the paradox of happiness. Why, as people have all the problems that advancing age brings, why would they be happier? So I began to think about that, and I began to say to myself, well, is there something older people know about living a happy and healthy and fulfilling life that young people don't? And could we get that information on a large scale using the wisdom of crowds and make it available to young people and people of all ages? Because we live in a self-help world, and I admit that I'm a self-help junkie. I go to that aisle first in the bookstore. There are about 30,000 titles on the market right now, with titles like you're seeing here, and they often or typically aren't based on anything. They're either a celebrity's thoughts, a pop psychologist, an athlete's view. They aren't really based on anything. And it seemed to me that when we're looking for life wisdom, as I started out this talk, why wouldn't we go to the oldest Americans? So, however, that does raise a question, and it's one that emerged after this book was published, 30 Lessons for Living. I got an email from a college professor in Massachusetts who told me that he didn't buy it. He learned more from his students than he learned from any older people. And he wanted to know, why did I call the oldest Americans the wisest Americans? And I felt obligated to think about that and answer it. And in that, to bring in two more social science concepts, if you're looking at the question of, which has always interested me, by the way, why do people turn out the way they do? Why over the course of life does someone end up here and someone else there? There are two things we look at. And the first of those is developmental. So how individuals change over the life course. And one major finding over the last couple of decades is that what characterizes people in particular in their 70s and beyond developmentally is this sense of a limited time horizon. And this viewpoint has a great name, which you can feel free to drop at cocktail parties if you don't know it, called socio-emotional selectivity. And by that, it means that older people, when they encounter this limited time horizon, it doesn't so much depress them as it helps them make better choices. So people begin, for example, to value experiences and people over things, which research shows us makes people happier. They begin to exit difficult relationships and focus on those relationships which are more rewarding. So that limited time horizon, as we'll see when I share some of the elders' lessons, is one important developmental thing. But also developmentally, older people, especially in their 80s and 90s and beyond, have personally experienced everything that keeps younger people awake at night, from divorce to widowhood, to unemployment to illness. So that's another important factor. Now, the other piece of the social science model is your cohort. So the group of people, sometimes we call it generation, but that gets mixed up with families. So sociologists say cohort. What you've been through because of when you were born. So when I was interviewing people, and we still continue to interview folks in their 90s who've had these experiences, people that experience poverty, immigration, upheaval, war, they're certainly familiar with hard economic times. Even people who were born in the late 30s or 40s experienced some of the aftermath of the Great Depression. So there was an experience growing up with less. There also, for a lot of people, was a different sense of community, this sort of not locking your doors and that kind of thing. One thing I would say about this too is right now we're in the midst of just a horrific experience with the war in Ukraine, for example. Though we have many people, though, who have lived through the same kind of fear, uncertainty from World War II through the Vietnam War, through the Korean War. For older people, there is a knowledge and wisdom from prior experience about what it's like, about what happens to people, about how to help and how to be generous. And so that's what we mean by cohort. So a fundamental assumption, even though you wouldn't necessarily go to older people, and I count myself included as the person to reprogram the DVR or tell you who the latest reality star is, older people are the most credible experts available, or this is a working hypothesis of this project, on how to live well through hard times. And they're a vastly underutilized resource. So let me tell you a bit about the Cornell Legacy Project, but that's the background, the importance of wisdom and how we don't really tap it. So I use standard social science methods for this project. Although I presented the results in a book, which is a little less usual for academics, but I felt that was the best way to present it. And the one thing I mentioned earlier, I didn't want just a few interviews. I wanted a large and diverse sample so I could really use the wisdom of crowds here. So it began with a self-report survey where we asked people in different venues simply to write in their life's lessons. And then we actually got a number of, very carefully handwritten letters back then. Then we also, on the far side, did an in-depth interview survey where people like you, say, or experts, other folks, nominated individuals who they felt were wise. And that got us really good in-depth information. But those could both be bias samples. So we also did a true national random sample survey. And one story I like to tell is, you could have been in your living room if you were 70 or older and gotten a call, and the person said, "Hi, I'm from Cornell University. I want to ask you about your lessons for living." One older gentleman did say, "I'll tell you my lesson for living. It's not answering goddamn telephone surveys." However, I will say he actually gave us an interview. And one of the beauties of surveying older people still is that they are more likely to say yes to interviews, and they have landlines still, which you cannot underestimate. So we got this very broad survey. Now, in the time I have remaining, I want to spend some time on the lessons themselves. And then if we have time, tell you briefly about the intergenerational program that we created. But I mostly don't want to focus on this question of what are the main themes of the main lessons that hundreds of older people give you, because we carefully coded these and analyzed the qualitative data, of which there were mountains. And there are 30 lessons in the book. There were many, many more lessons that were distilled into them, and I only have a few minutes. So the way I like to do this is there were several themes that were so present from almost every older person across ethnic groups and locations and any other variables. It's almost like people were drawing on the same data bank. So I'll touch on those general points and then give you a few specific examples under each one. So if there was one lesson that people metaphorically or literally pounded their fists on the table and said to me, if there's one thing I want you to tell younger people in your book, it's this. And that's that life is short, or life is really short, or life is really, really, really short. As one older engineer told me, it passed by in a nanosecond. And one of my favorite quotes is from a woman who was 99, who was getting ready to turn 100. And she said, and this is a direct quote, "I don't know what happened, because the next thing you know, you're 100. And that was true. The older the person was, the more likely they were to say, I can't believe how quickly life passed. It just seemed to have gone by so quickly. So the question, and let me give an example. This is Jesse. I will say a couple of the videos are softer, so you may need to adjust the volume on your own computer or tablet or phone, however you're watching. I think Jesse is one person who's a little that. This notion that young people treat time the way, say, someone in a desert tribe, their view of how young people treat time is how someone in a desert tribe, for example, might view our profligate use of water. That, really, it comes down to things like, are you really going to look back and think that spending 20 hours a week playing video games was the way you should have spent your life, because it's much shorter than you think it is? So that might sound like a platitude. And the question is, what do they say you should do? And let me give you a couple of examples. One of the surprising things I found in this group, especially the oldest ones who lived through the Great Depression, either as children, and in some cases as adults, was I expected them to say, go out and get a job and find the highest paying and most secure job you can find, whether you like it or not, because the rug can be pulled out from under you at any moment. And I actually found the complete reverse of that. So for any of you in the audience who are thinking whether, like now's the time for a career change to something more fulfilling, America's elders at least would tell you definitely that to choose work for its intrinsic value rather than its extrinsic value, again, because life is so short. Now, it's not that they want you to be a starving artist. And this interviewee was a very successful businessman. He had been a serial entrepreneur, was still involved in business well into his 80s. And he sums up this viewpoint, I think, well. I loved what I did. And I made money at it. And since doing this work, I try to bite my tongue, but every time one of my students says, I really want to be a chef or an artist, but I'm going to spend 10 years in the financial services industry, and then I'll do it. That's not what the elders in general suggest. Two more quick things. One strong point is to say things now. Unless you believe in seances, it will sometimes be too late to apologize, to reconcile, to ask forgiveness, even to ask for information. I'm greatly regretful. I am at fault here. I wish I had talked more to people who knew my parents when they were still alive, for example. So really saying things now. And I want to touch on travel because I think it gets at elder wisdom, especially for the group who was born in 1945 and before. Their lives were often extremely local. So I interviewed people in West Texas who, until they served in the military, had never been outside of their county. I interviewed a 93-year-old nun who told me in Rochester, New York, who told me that their exciting adventure travel was leaving their Polish enclave and going into the German neighborhood for dinner, so that their lives were very local and they loved and savored travel. So one quote was, if you have a choice of a kitchen remodel or of going on a trip, I say go on a trip. It took my own, kind of family, my own spouse a while to embrace that viewpoint, but now I think we're completely there. A second lesson, again, may sound like a platitude until you think of who's saying it. So they over and over argue that happiness is a choice and not a condition. For those of you in psychology, this viewpoint is quite consistent with principles of cognitive behavioral therapy too, the idea that you choose to be happy on a daily basis. And you'll recall, like, allow me to remind you that almost all of these people all of them had major and significant losses over their lives. Almost all had very significant chronic conditions, being as old as they were. And yet they still argued, to wake up in the morning and feel as good as you can, to make a choice. Their view is that young people believe in happiness in spite of, happiness if only. I'll be happy if only I get a job, or if only I get a new job, or only if I get a partner, if only I lose my partner. They argue that you have to be happy in spite of things. And that's a key lesson. As the one person told me, this in my earliest interviews, sooner or later, she said, you'll realize you have to take responsibility for your own happiness. Many of them, I would say maybe close to half, who mentioned this lesson, learned it through the experience of actually doing it, going through a tragedy and deciding that you have to make a conscious choice to be happy. And this is Helga. And Helga's story was briefly this. She grew up in a wonderful, warm, and loving upper middle class family in Berlin. And as a child, this was destroyed with the advent of Hitler and the Nazis. They fled to Cuba, which was taking refugees at the time with absolutely nothing. They were impoverished, moved to the US. Finally, the family regrouped, and she was able to create her own loving family on Long Island. But she experienced a tragedy in which she learned this notion of having to choose to be happy. And I think that she's a great example with this event that occurred to this tragic event that occurred to one of her children.
She was my middle
people I had met. So in terms of what you should do more specifically, I just have to touch on this one because it was so unexpected. The issue of worrying came up when we asked people, what can younger people do to reach your age and not have regrets? So how can you avoid having regrets? The one thing that many people said is, first of all, if you get to my age with no regrets at all, you probably haven't lived that interesting a life. So don't necessarily make that your goal. But I expected when we asked them about regrets, to have big ticket items, an affair, a shady business deal. I was not prepared to hear so many of them say, I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying. They really view mindless worry, not planning, because they're big planners, especially in this age range, but mindless worrying about something over which one has no control. And the quote that I think encapsulates this for me is someone who told me there were going to be layoffs in my job. And I worried for 3 months about that, ruined my life, even though I didn't have any control over it. And she paused for a minute and said, at this stage of my life, I wish I had those 3 months back. And that was a common notion. Now, how do you stop worrying? The only thing, I can't go into that in great detail, but I will say that I am a Woody Allen-esque chronic worrier. And knowing that, 1,200 grandparent age people are in a room yelling at me that I will regret worrying so much later in life has had an impact. So I think it can be helpful. Older people tend to be natural savorers. So over and over, they said, especially as they got into the later stages of life, savoring the small, and these were direct examples from the interviews, a colorful bird on the lawn, the first cup of coffee in the morning, warm bed on a cold night, the silly antics of the dog. They began to savor small experiences. So those would be some practical tips. I just want to go through 2 more lessons very quickly. One is overwhelmingly people said that aging was in some ways a pleasant surprise, very much like the paradox of happiness and the socio-emotional selectivity idea that they were surprised at how good they felt about some things. Many people, especially in their 90s and beyond, said they felt freer and clearer to some extent about life. One woman who was in her 90s and still living on her family's ranch in the West said, "My advice about growing old, I tell people to find the magic in it." And this is despite all of them having serious problems. But one of my favorite examples of this is Jackie. Jackie, at the time she was interviewed, was in her late 70s and still working. And when we asked her if she was going to retire, here's what she said. When I see this video, I do wonder how Uncle Hatchet got his name, but that's probably, I forgot to ask that one when I could. So there you go. In terms of aging, I'll just say briefly, and I'm going to skip, the next video so we have some time for questions. But I want to say that a common theme is learning to be social. Now, they don't want everyone to be glad-handing, backslapping extroverts, but as people aged, and especially after they left the workforce, very often they said they had to at least learn how to reach out to some extent, or they became too isolated. And finally, I do want to share with you this notion of never give up on love. I just like to share this because it's a great story, but also even in the 80s and 90s and beyond, one thing there is an opportunity for that I learned in these interviews are chances for transformation, chances for something new. One thing I often say when I give talks like this is younger people have a very truncated view of old age, and really many of us do still. There was a famous cartoon on the cover of the New Yorker called The Manhattanites' View of the World. And it's basically Manhattan was huge and it stopped at the East River and the next thing was California. Well, it's very similar with most people. After 60, it's sort of this uncharted territory, but when in fact people may have as much lifetime as they had, for example, in the workforce. So there's a structural lag there where we haven't gotten this through our heads. So many of the older people talked about, of my interviewees, new things, transformations, interesting things. And one was the surprising degree to which people who thought it would never happen, found love. And the person I'd like to show you is Kitty. And Kitty had been a wave in World War II. For those of you too young to know, women could not always serve in the Navy, so they served in the Women's Naval Corps. She was in uniform. It was after World War II had just ended, and she met her boyfriend and then her husband, and he proposed. She told me she was a city girl, loved the city, had no interest in moving out of it, but he was a geologist and asked her if she would move with him to the oil fields of Southern California for a year or two. And she said it turned out to be 20. And her very difficult mother-in-law moved in next door. She told me, I left him in my mind hundreds of times, but they worked together, struggled. He learned to communicate better, and so did she. The next 40 years of their 60-year marriage was wonderful. She said it was really great. He then developed Parkinson's. She cared for him. He died. She finally moved into assisted living in the city and just assumed love was over for her, even though it had been very important to her. But life has strange twists. And here is, I have to say that I have to just share, I showed this same video to a group, and a 90-year-old guy got up sort of in his early 90s and talked about his experience in the war and sort of rambled a bit. And I asked, do you have a question? And he said, yeah, can I get Kitty's number? And I said, she already has a boyfriend. I mean, so that was, they're still there. So finally, this notion, I'd like to stop the lessons with one final one, which is this concept of living a life without regrets. And even though we think of older people getting more conservative, which actually isn't true, they were radical about saying yes to opportunities unless there's a good reason to say no, and taking risks. Older women especially envied younger women's kind of greater opportunities, and over based on their own more limited opportunities, encourage them to take risk. So I think it sums up this spirit. This is Eleanor. Why don't you pause the recording now, because we have to hear the first part of this. So let me, I do want to share for just a few minutes one place that we've gone from here. When the book came out and I began to give talks like these, over and over we were asked, how can we put this into practice with young people? There certainly is a sense of young people being very disconnected from older people's wisdom. And the people wanted a program that they could use. So starting a number of years ago, we created and then just recently have finished an actual randomized controlled study of it, which found really positive results. So it has an evidence base to it called Building a Community Legacy Together. And I want to share a bit with it. You can, I think that you can get people, my email address, you can inquire, or if you Google or search for Building a Community Legacy Together, Cornell, you actually get to a web page that has all the materials and everything people really essentially need to run the program. And we also offer support in running it. But it provides, in brief, a structured opportunity for middle and high school age youth. It's mostly high school, but also older middle age youth, who in a structured way interview older adults about their advice for living. And it allows young people to sort of experience advice on a personal level, but with the goal of their using it, applying it, talking about it, and therefore getting better respect for the wisdom of age and combating ageism. Older participants are also get, as I said at the beginning, these complementary needs. It's the opportunity to express generativity, it's actually quite different from storytelling interventions like tell me your life story, which are meant to benefit the older person and place them in a passive role. This places the youth participants in the role of learner from a bona fide expert. So it really provides them more of a sense of empowerment. I won't go into this in detail because the presentation will be made available, but there are 5 units where there is training on how to do these interviews. The interviews are role played, so youth are not sent in with no background. There's sort of an overview of elder wisdom. So there's a lot of preparation. There also is a little bit of a social science STEMs, so to speak, component where there's a discussion of why do we do interviews? How do you process the data? They interview older people, and then they work together to summarize the interviews and to present them to members of their local community, typically to parents, family, friends, other students, and the older participants themselves. They summarize these lessons. One good thing about it, I won't read through these, but the youth participants are encouraged to make the questions relevant. So, so the questions like, have you been bullied? One thing that's happened is groups of immigrant kids have interviewed immigrant elders about how they handled the immigrant experience, how folks dealt, say, with discrimination, how did they deal with controversial issues. So one thing about it, it's customized for what youth are interested in. And the community presentation reinforces how valuable this is and have been very, so here they are actually presenting the older people's lessons. The evaluation findings were for a fairly small sample, unusually strong, that for proximal outcomes, feeling more comfortable interacting with older people, improved attitudes towards older people, greater interest in eventually working with older people were all strongly positive for the treatment group against the control group. Also, the sense of purpose increased. There was also increase in self-esteem that didn't rise to statistical significance, but quite likely would have with a larger sample. So I want to conclude here by a little bit of a soapbox, and then we'll have at least a few minutes for questions. This is Gert, who was interviewed, and whose interview I played for you, and her assistant. Unfortunately, I will say she did pass away at around 102, but was happy and cognitively present and everything until then. So when she was still alive, and now they still do it, the members of her assisted living community go out and do like a pop-up dance routine in public places, like this happens to be Union Square. And they come out and basically dance to what is essentially hip hop music. I think if you look up, elder pop-up dancing Union Square, you can actually find some videos. So I think it's that kind of spirit that is embodied in this legacy project and what we studied. And I think it's absolutely critical right now, because I believe that we are in the midst of a very dangerous experiment. Namely that young people now are growing up with almost no contact with older people outside of intermittent contacts in their own family. That our society is as segregated by age. It's the most age segregated society possibly, and history might be too strong, but it's really age segregated. If you look at research on social networks, people are more likely to have a close friend of a different race than they are to have a close personal friend who's 10 years older or 10 years younger than they are. And if you don't believe me, I ask you to tell me about the last time that a 28-year-old had people over for beer, pizza, and the Super Bowl and invited his 74-year-old close personal friend to join in. Our social networks are very limited by age. And I think that is a real problem as we enter an aging society, and leads to massive misunderstanding of old age and what it is. So I think that we do need to take this on. It's hard to put that genie back in the bottle because of the ways that society has progressed. But we're hoping, at least incrementally, through programs like Building a Community Legacy Together, you can begin to do that, because we have to figure out a way that meaningful and life-promoting interactions can occur. But we're very happy to work with anybody who's interested. And let me stop right there. For anybody who's old enough, we can see the Hollywood Squares coming back up.
Thank you so much. Now, just because we're a little short of time, I'm going to have David do our formal thanks. David Burns do our formal thanks. And then I know people might need to leave, but others might want to ask some questions. Would you stay another 5 or 10 minutes afterwards, Karl, to answer questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, David, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I am very happy to thank Karl here in providing the Wilson Abernethy lecture today. As we mentioned, we really don't do this distinguished lecture every year. And Karl certainly embodies the merits of a distinguished gerontologist in every way. And so we feel very fortunate that Karl talked with us today. So thank you. I personally feel very lucky to call Karl a mentor, a collaborator, a friend, and I'm just very excited that he's spending some time with us up here over the next few months. The Legacy Project really represents a profound body of work. And as you say, it brings to light the strengths and the resilience of older adults, as opposed to only focusing on the problems. I find it fascinating to hear these lessons shared by these older adults. And it's hard not to kind of bring this back into your own kind of mindset to kind of reflect on the extent to which I'm applying these lessons myself. But anyways, I do want to thank you, Karl, for giving the Abernethy lecture today, and also thank everyone in attendance today for participating in this event. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thanks, David. And no, we're lucky to have a colleague like David working with us. So, it's that's really fantastic too. So thank you, David. Yes, and I can stay for a little while longer if folks would like to talk about these issues. I don't know if I haven't seen the chat. If anyone, I'm not sure whether any questions came up in it.
Yeah, there were a few. So many people said thank you and how inspirational it was and how happy they were to have done it. Some people were asking about the program, the BCLT program. I did put a link in the chat for that. So feel free to grab that if you're interested in following up about the program how-tos. There's a question by Val. Val Lisk, do you want to say it or do you want me to read it?
And Esme, let me just share one quick thing. So we have actually sort of transformed, or we've created a virtual version of BCLT where it can be done entirely or almost entirely online because it was so difficult to arrange these interviews during COVID, and it's actually worked extremely well. So one of our staff people can also help people who would like to run a virtual version. Sorry, go ahead.
Perfect. And I know that there's people from like the Canadian Federation of University Women. It would be a fantastic project for one of those groups to connect with a community college or a high school and kind of do it that way. There's a comment here from Val Lisk or Vernon saying, I've noticed that in the last decade or so, an increasing lack of good coping skills in people, many of these non-elders. Did any elder have a similar experience when younger, and or any advice on what people can do to increase their ability to cope with life changes?
That is such an interesting question. And it has led me to some thinking, and some people have speculated. People in my generation on, well, with the exception of the Vietnam War, which was a real upheaval, but many of us weren't personally threatened. You know, there has been no comparable experience to, say, the Great Depression and World War II, in which people were tested. They were sort of ultimate limit situations, as one psychologist calls it. The one question is the pandemic going to serve a little bit of that function with young people? So have people had this experience of having to be more resilient, having to change their lifestyle? I mean, one of the major differences, of course, is in World War II and the Great Depression, there was intensive social solidarity, and here there's been more disruption. So I think that is one factor in younger people now, is that many of them haven't had these kinds of experiences of adversity, and therefore don't have some of the coping skills. I don't know of a study that has measured it exactly, because it's sort of hard to measure these coping skills because the external world has changed so much and people have to cope with such different difficulties and pressures. So I don't know if we have a scientific answer to it, but I do think that the ability to experience adversity and overcome it was more pronounced, especially in the kind of war and crisis generation than it is now. And that would be a good study, actually. But it's also very hard to disentangle this cohort and development. So be it like, just because you've lived longer, you've developed more coping skills often. So it's hard to know what comes from the fact that people have lived longer and what they've lived through, but it's something worth disentangling.
Great. So Mary had a comment, which she actually put in before you showed your person with Uncle Hatchet, but she had a question. I think it reflects that, having read the book, I know it's in there, but the idea of, did people of different socioeconomic statuses and racialized respondents, did they come up with some of the same themes or different themes, or did you notice anything specific?
It's a really important and very interesting question. And the answer is yes and no. So if I took 100 sets of lessons and blinded them by race and ethnicity, you would not notice any substantial difference. So that across income levels, educational levels, with one maybe with one regional difference in the US, but there was very little difference at all in the actual lessons and how they were distributed. What was very different was how people got there. So that many people said, take risks in your career, be persistent to do what you want to do. But African Americans in the sample were way more likely to discuss overcoming prejudices the way they got there. Women too talked about their struggles. So it was that kind of a paradox. The actual lessons in the end were very, very similar. But how people got there was different. And I even, in the second book on love, romance, and marriage, a very similar factor occurred because I included same-sex couples, long-term same-sex couples, who were talking about their advice for relationships, and heterosexual couples. And again, you would not have found almost any difference in the lessons themselves, but the pathway to them was different. And we did have diverse samples, by the way, in all of these studies. The national surveys oversampled for African Americans and Hispanics. We also used our senior centers in New York City to get a very diverse group of in-person interviewees. So, but the one difference, individuals from the American South were somewhat more likely to bring God and religion into their lessons. So, it would often come up, the first lesson might be something that was more of a fundamentalist religious nature. But often then after that, people typically moved on to more generic lessons too. It's like they had to get that out of the way. And that was a regional difference that we did find, which is also consistent with what we know about regional differences in the US.
So two other questions. Beth asked if this recording will be available. It may take us a week to get it up because we have to make sure that we haven't got the video part. So it will be without the video of the older respondents. We will have it posted on our Institute for Life Course and Aging website. Maybe Susan can just pop that into the link in there, or Nina. That would be great. And this has been just so wonderful. Elaine was saying, would it be a good book for students? I have to tell you, I bought this book and the relationship book and given it out to all kinds of people. I think if you're asking about students in particular classes, I think you need to read it to see if it fits for it. But certainly as a stocking stuffer kind of book, it's a wonderful feel-good
it's also been
sermon.
Fairly wide, not hugely adopted. It would be only an ancillary text, but both books are the 30 lessons for living and loving have had reasonable use in college classes, especially if you want to have this sort of qualitative flavor. So that the course adoptions just seem to have worked, but you're right, it would depend on the course and what the goals of it are.
Absolutely. And Shobha asked, has a similar project been done anywhere else in the world? I mean, there was another question about where have your spin-offs of your program been, and also have people done it in other countries, I guess.
That's a great question. So far, the only one that's done it, and we published one sort of general article, not actual findings, has been Italy. So a colleague in Italy has used very similar methods and also has replicated the Building a Community Legacy program together, Building a Community Legacy Together program in Italy. Aspects of the wisdom interviews and others have been used in some places, but in terms of replication, there hasn't been another real formal replication except in Italy.
Great, wonderful. So does anyone else want to jump in and have any other questions? There's lots of words like inspirational and uplifting here, and you really was absolutely a delight. If any of you are interested in any of our other lecture series at that aging.utoronto.ca, you can see what else we have coming up going forward.
Esme, I'm sorry, I don't know if you actually, there are two different possible websites. Okay. One is the one that has the BCLT program in it. Is it which one did you share? Yes, great. So you shared that one. There also is our legacy, like if you Google Cornell Legacy Project. So we still maintain an active website where we post lessons. It also has links to a YouTube channel that has some videos that are at least somewhat similar to these. So it's very easy to find, Cornell Legacy Project takes you right there. But that does not have information on this program.
Okay, I'm going to add that.
Thanks, everyone. This has been just such a great Canadian welcome. I'm really glad to have been here with all of you, and hope and please do get in touch if you're interested in, these programs, and we'll get back to you.
And you can reach out to us and we can redirect that too, if you would like. So thank you
Excellent.
everyone for coming. We had over 90 people here in the middle of the week. So we really appreciate you coming, and we hope it was, you found it as inspiring as I did. Take care.
Well, thanks to all of you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.